All right, so my name is Ashley Rogers. I'm here with Ed Gonzales. This session is Makers and Devs, Different Paths, Same Solution. So I'm super excited to get into this. I think we've got some great content for you tonight. And before we get into that, we've got some housekeeping to do. Okay, so first and most exciting is that the SharePoint conference has now been rebranded as the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. Looks like it's going to be in Las Vegas again, so that's very exciting. And so hopefully you guys will see us there and mark your calendars. Thanks, of course, to all of the sponsors. I think it's great that even though we're doing this virtually and we can't be in person for these things right now, we still have some great sponsors who are willing to support the community and be here for us. So thank you very much. Awesome. Okay, so as I said, my name is Ashley Rogers. I am the product manager for SharePoint apps and business process management at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. I've been doing nothing but SharePoint for the last 10 years. I like to joke that it is my longest relationship, and my husband likes to roll his eyes at me when I say that. I have played every role in SharePoint, from administrator to developer to consultant. I've worked at small and large companies, and really just seen SharePoint grow up in the last 10 years from all angles. For the last couple of years, I've been actually focused in the Power Platform, and particularly in Power Automate, which is what we'll be talking about today. I am a speaker and a blogger, and you can check out my blog at spinbetween.blogspot.com or follow me on Twitter at @ashrogers.
Hi there, and I'm Ed Gonzales, very new MVP, Microsoft MVP in the business applications, and also brand new Microsoft certified trainer, power user in the Power Automate community. I've been doing this for a little bit, speaking and blogging as well. My blog's flyingpolymath.com, and you can find me on Twitter at poweredbyedg. Don't worry if you don't get that, we'll have it at the end as well. Okay, so getting into the two personas that we're going to talk about today, the idea is the makers and the devs. So the makers would be, what used to be called, or maybe still is called in some places, the citizen developer. It's the business user, it's the person like me, who maybe was in management, maybe was in marketing, maybe was, in any number of things. Not what I call classically trained in some development tools, but has an intent and an idea to kind of do things better and maybe do some automation and things like that. It's really, and maybe I'm being selfish here, but it's kind of what I consider the target audience of Power Automate. The folks that really just kind of need, or maybe don't need, but gravitate towards, a graphical interface and something that helps them do their jobs a little bit better.
So developers that we're going to be talking about tonight, these folks, I consider them to be coming from a more traditional IT background. They don't have to necessarily have been formally trained. This is not something to say that you're not a developer unless you've gone to school and gotten that degree that says I've done CS. But they have spent time in their careers coding and understanding programming concepts. So this is somebody like me. I don't actually have a CS degree. It's not something I went to school for, but I've been doing it long enough that I ended up being thrown into development very early on in my career, and that's served me pretty well. So these, again, they're folks that use Power Automate primarily to streamline development and to support the business, and also to automate their own daily tasks. But these folks have the hooks to hang things on. They understand the concepts like variables and apply to each and switch and things like that. This stuff comes pretty naturally to them because they've already seen that terminology. But the challenge for the traditional IT person is to support so many makers inside the Power Platform. So the reason that this is useful for them to understand where the makers are coming from is because they need to really disseminate that. They need to delegate those tasks as far as supporting the makers because it gets a bit overwhelming. So learning how to frame flows for folks who aren't as experienced is really the first step in bringing together the business and IT. Potential technical difficulties. Stand by.
I was monologuing, sorry. So for the makers, the intent or my intent here is to really just sort of share some high level like ideas that might bring you closer to some techniques that the developers are using. And also, make everyone's life a little bit easier. I'm not going to step into the detailed how-to aspects. And I'll probably, just kind of link off to some cool articles and things like that. And then that way you've got, at least a direction or some stuff to look up as you go. All right. The first one that we're going to chat about is the compose action. I like this one. This was like a big sort of transitional thing for me. It's a flexible way to handle, all different sorts of data. It allows you to use that information in other steps. So from the maker's perspective, if you've ever kind of clicked on a field and expected to see a dynamic value from a previous step and didn't, most likely the types aren't lining up from what it's expecting and what the previous step is passing. Throwing that into a compose will help alleviate some of that. And it's also a good place for you to put expressions like as you're starting to build things, it'll let you build the expression in there and then store the results so that you can use that value there later on. I also like to store my release notes in there. This is kind of a new trick that I picked up at another conference up in Oregon, where they had a compose up at the top of their flow, and that's where they stored all of the changes that they made along the way. So it would have a date and here's what I did. And so I started doing that just to kind of keep track of what I was doing. The other reason I like compose, so when I first started, I was doing a lot of variables and to do kind of the same work. And then John Liu kind of pulled me aside and said, compose is a lot faster. And he actually, in the bit.ly link below is another conference where he talks about how compose is pretty much twice as fast as using the variables when you can use it. And actually in the next hour block, I think he's going to be doing either the same or a similar presentation, so that might be a good one to catch. Next kind of tip and trick for the maker audience is working with comments and or renaming your steps. Working in the community a lot, like I see a lot of folks that are kind of new, and this isn't a bad thing. It's just one of those things that you don't really think about until it bites you. Renaming your steps helps you later on when you're trying to grab dynamic values and you want to make sure you're grabbing them from the right step. So one of the things I like to coach people to do is, as you're building this thing, get in there, rename the step like right away, and then that way you have the structure of it pretty cleanly as you're building it on later, right? The other thing is, when things error out, it gives you an opportunity to know exactly which step is causing you trouble and why. And then also with comments, one of the things that I like doing is I'll add in, you can see here what the intent of that action is. Here I've got a little bit of a condition, or what's called a try catch. And I wanted to explain, not just for me, but also somebody else that might be coming in to look at this, what's the intent of that thing, right? And then way back in the day, it was kind of cumbersome when you wrote an expression, whether it was in a compose or whether it was someplace else. You'd go to click on it and it would take you to an empty window, or you couldn't see your expression. And so one habit that people got into doing was putting their expressions, copying and pasting them into the comments section, so that way as you're looking at the action, you could actually see what all the expression looked like. Nowadays, we don't really have that trouble. You can hover over it and you can see the expression. You click on it and you get to see everything in its full glory. So it's a lot better now, but that's just one other thing you can do with the comments that might make things a little bit easier for you. And to get to both of these, you would just click on the ellipses for that particular action, and you can see you can access both the rename or the edit comment. Okay. So the next thing I want to chat about that makes things super fun are scopes, or is scopes. I'm not sure what the grammatical correctness is right there. But what scopes are is kind of like a bucket. So I could create this bucket and throw a bunch of actions in there. It's super convenient if I've got like one of the flows that I built had several paths that were very similar. There wasn't much different, and this is all within the same flow. And so rather than either copying and pasting each action one by one over to the other path, or even adding it straight from scratch, I copied or I dragged each of the actions into a scope, and then I was able to copy and paste the entire scope, and it brought each of those actions along with it. Something to keep in mind if you're copying and pasting, from one flow to another flow, any dynamic values, of course, are going to lose their reference because they're referencing something else that doesn't exist in the new flow. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the status of the scope is tied to the individual statuses of the actions within it. So in my example up on the screen now, if anything inside that scope fails, then the status of that scope would fail as well, which is actually kind of handy, and we'll talk about that in the next slide when we chat about error handling. So when you're first starting out, and this is me not too long ago, right? Error handling was essentially, every couple of days I'd get an email automated from Microsoft saying, hey, that thing you built that everybody's been relying on failed a couple of times last week. And then you have to go and, click on the runs and take a look and see which runs failed and start troubleshooting it and figuring it out. Why did it fail? There's a tool now inside that basically lets you do something if the flow fails, right? And that's taking advantage of something called configure run after. So the same ellipsis where we clicked on to rename or edit the comment, we now click on that and do configure run after. And what that does is it pulls up this screen that says, only do this thing if the previous step has failed, if it was successful, if it was skipped, or if it was timed out. So you can see you can create some scenarios where, if this thing is skipped, and I'll show this in subsequent image, if a step is skipped, then it does this other thing as well, okay? The other thing too is you can use it as kind of like a makeshift condition. I actually just published a blog, and the link to that's below, where in this example that I've got up on the screen, if my check existing user step if the user doesn't exist, then it errors out, right? And so the next step, if I get that error, is to add that user to the list, okay? So it's kind of a condition, and there's other things you can do to make it more elegant, I guess. But that's just what I did. And then I later found out that that's actually what's called a try catch finally, or a try catch continue. And what that is it's a thing that developers use all the time that basically says, do the thing. That's the try part of it. And then the catch is, this is what you do if the thing errors out. And then the finally or the continue bit means no matter what, you do this part, right? And so in this example, I check for the existing user. If the user doesn't exist, it's going to error out, which means that my next step, the add lead to master list, will run. And then if either way, whether it fails or is successful, it's going to go ahead and add them to a marketing segment inside MailChimp, which was pretty handy and I thought pretty cool. The other thing is you can do the same idea with scopes, right? So remembering back to the last slide, if a single action inside the scope fails, then the whole thing will fail. So in this instance, you can see I've grouped a bunch of actions within a try scope. And if that errors out, then I've got some other actions inside that catch scope. And then no matter what, that finally scope will run, okay? And so now Ashley will chat a little bit about the developers aspects.
Okay, so it looks like at this point we don't have any questions. I want to check in with you guys that if there are any questions, if anybody has anything they'd like to surface, absolutely feel free to do that. We are happy to take questions during the presentation as well as after, but right now it doesn't look like we have anything. Okay, great. Let's take a look at how developers can work closely with makers for a better experience with Power Automate. And the first thing that I want to bring up is kind of going back to that concept of compose. So Ed already touched on using compose at the top of your flow, but we can actually take that a step further. So for the developers, do you remember how great it was to keep your notes all in one script and how we all made amazing, useful comments for our code? And, and the person who picked it up would, of course, have this beautiful, reference to have. Yeah, me neither. That didn't usually happen. Usually I make comments for myself, but not necessarily for the person who had to support it. And that's just sort of lazy, right? But we know that the right way to do it is to make sure that those comments are there. But either way, the comments that you make for yourself or for somebody else are pretty helpful. So they indicate which sections of the code do what, and they also make sure that people understand why we care about them and what has changed version over version. So the idea of using compose is great to have not only at the top of your flow for release notes, but also peppered throughout, particularly large flows. This is where that's very helpful, where if you're handing this off to somebody else, you can put those in different stages so that people understand, oh, this apply to each is used for this, or this switch is used for that. Why do I have parallel branches? Well, we've got some compose notes and all of that. You may not think about comments being useful in flows that you're making for yourself, but when you're creating them to hand off to somebody else, this is definitely helpful. And of course, when you come back yourself a year later to a flow that needs to be updated, it's very, very helpful. This is, of course, different than the description inside the flow details. There is sort of this flow dashboard, and then when you go into a flow, there's a details pane, and in there, that's what I use for the major releases and functional descriptions. Compose is really for getting down and dirty and getting your hands in there and understanding what each section of the flow is actually doing while you're doing maintenance on it. Okay, so let's go a bit deeper into how you can create flows with makers in mind. I see this as sort of a natural part of delegating support from IT and developers towards the makers and the folks who are actually using those flows every day. So there's three things that you really want to consider for each flow. So the first is, who is the solution owner going to be? If it's you, the person who's developing, it's not such a big deal. But if you're the one who is creating this and supporting the makers by assisting in development, but you're intending to pass that off to them afterwards, and they're going to support the flow in the long term, you're going to want to consider their level of experience and how easy it's going to be for them to troubleshoot. Because as you come along, they'll come back to you for updates, and they'll come back to you for help there if you haven't really designed it as something that they can themselves maintain. So that does bring us to the second point here. Who troubleshoots? Are your makers doing the tier 1 support on their own flows, or are you responsible for all of the error investigation? This is where I see this is a great opportunity to empower the makers to handle the flows themselves. And this is, again, a point that I'm harping on here, just delegating the work from IT to the business. And that's a great investment sort of in the long term, especially if you have a really big company with many, many makers to support. This really takes the onus off of IT for having to be the go-to for every single flow. And finally, empowering your makers is really going to help when updates need to be added to the flows. This does mean that you'll have to approach flows a bit differently, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next slide. So from a developer perspective, there is certainly a quote unquote better way to do things. Ed mentioned before that using compose actions instead of variables and using certain expressions, those are more efficient than using actions that achieve a similar outcome. But what I've found is that the most efficient flows are not necessarily the most maintainable. If at the end of the day, your goal is to actually hand off the flow to a citizen developer or to a maker, or if you're simply providing guidance and process improvement, actions actually serve a better purpose in your flows than expressions. Okay, so what do we do in the long term then? How do we turn this approach into a sustainable process? So this is where I recommend you find your ally in the business. These are non-traditional or citizen developers. They're the ones who are excited to get their hands dirty in Power Automate. You'll find a couple of those as they bring projects to you. They'll be the person who says, oh, I looked this up already and here's my suggestion. So curious folks who want to help, these are the ones that you can consider your ally inside the business. With some of the makers, you'll have to invest some time in mentoring them, but I see that as truly an investment. Once they get the basics, they're usually off and running on their own. So again, this is just where you as the developer already have the terminology, you already have the language, and you're just helping people to understand and kind of break those concepts down. So really going back to the basics and helping people understand how they can make their flows better. So spending time with those concepts helps them improve skills and then become a champion in the platform. So whereas you begin building your flows with them in mind, with those makers in mind, and maybe you're using actions and variables instead of expressions and compose actions, the people will graduate after a while towards using those. They'll figure out what's more efficient, and then what you'll do is you're really cultivating that next generation of citizen developers.
Yeah, the thing I like to say with that is, there's this sort of idea that, you can pretty much solve any problem with 3 lines of code. This is from the non-developer's perspective. And I've found that, I can solve the problem with actions. It takes me about 6 steps, but I can do it. So if you're the developer writing something that's going to be supported by somebody like me, maybe actions make more sense than having this really complex statement. And Ashley will show that in the demo.
Yeah, that actually brings us to the next piece. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up Power Automate. So we're going to switch. Okay. All right, so you guys should be seeing Power Automate right now. We're going to go into our first demo here. Okay, so as with a lot of the demos that I do, all I have here for my trigger is just a manually triggered flow. So if you haven't seen Power Automate before, this is a pretty standard setup, very straightforward. So I do recommend that you go into Power Automate, play around. It's very straightforward to get started with, but when I do a demo, I just have my manual trigger here. I want to illustrate a couple of points. So for folks who may not have used this before, if you're going to create a compose, we simply come up and insert a new step, add an action. And then all you have to do is search for exactly that action. You'll start to recognize as you get in here the different colors and the different icons that represent each type of connector. And after a while, you'll just be able to recognize those as they come up. But of course, just search for them if you're looking for them. So that's the compose action that we're talking about when we're talking about those release notes and sort of putting those throughout your flow. And in this this particular demo, what I did was I renamed another compose action to fruit, and I put an input in here that's apple. So the problem I'm trying to solve is not a business case one here. This is simply to demonstrate the difference down below between using a switch action here and then using compose instead to achieve the same thing. So I've got a compose here that's holding the value apple. And then I've also initialized a variable here called switchvar, and it's just a type string. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to input into switchvar the color that corresponds to the case of fruit here. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. So initializing my variables, setting up my compose actions, all the good stuff that I need to use. So I've opened up the switch action here, and you can see that what I've got is 2 different cases. So I've got a case apple, and I've got a case banana. Again, not business, it's not a real business case, just demonstrating how this works. And for each case, I set the switch var to something different. So in the case of apple, I'm setting switch var to red for apple, and then in banana, it's yellow. So you can see that what we do is we can nest different actions inside of the cases in Switch. And this is a great way to visually model the different paths that you have. So basically I'm putting in an input here, and based on that, we're doing different things. So if you are a maker, this is going to make a lot more sense than throwing this into an expression, because again, graphic interface, nice big buckets, I understand exactly where each thing goes and exactly what happens in each step. And when I run this, which I will do in just a moment, we're going to see that inputting apple is going to give me red. So let's just run that real quick. And even though that's going to run the entire thing here, all we're going to do is take a peek at the value coming back from Switch. So we know that we input apple, and then if I open up Switch, and we're no longer in edit mode, note that we're inside of a run here, we're going to see that this fell through into the apple case, and that switch var is now set to red. So pretty straightforward, very easy. We understand exactly where that's going. All right, so let's go ahead and edit this again. And one last thing I'm going to call out here is that in every switch, there is a default that happens. So if the input doesn't fall through into one of the cases here, it's going to go and resolve to the default, which if no case contains a matching value. In this case, what we're doing is setting the color of switch var to gray. So that's important in just a moment. So let's package switch back up. And then let's open up these compose actions. We're going to do one at a time and then look at what that looks like. So I'm actually going to go ahead and zoom in just a little bit because you guys are going to need to see what's going on in here. If I open up my first compose action here for a simple, what I have is an expression in here. And I'm going to go ahead and tempt the demo gods and open this up. We're going to look at this. So I've got all of this in here that basically is multiple expressions being used together. And what this resolves to is saying, look, if the output of fruit, which is the compose up there, if it's apple, then we're going to set this to red. So it's going to resolve to red, the actual compose. And if it's not apple, we're going to resolve this compose to gray. So you can see already that even though I'm just dealing with two cases, is it apple, yes or no, set it to red or set it to gray, that this is already kind of complicated. And we're using, even in this outputs here, looks like an expression, feels like an expression, multiple nested parens here. It's already complicated and we only have this one thing here.
So there's probably two messages here, and it's going to be sounding like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. On the one side, we're speaking to the devs. We're saying, okay, use the switch for the makers, the people like me, so that they can see what's going on. And then on the other side, I want to encourage the makers to look at the expression and understand it's not that scary, right? If you can manage some of the stuff in Excel, a lot of the stuff is the same kind of way. This expression here, I probably could do now, but I totally get that there was a time where I couldn't. And it was, just looking at this, and I'm like, gross, I don't want to get near that. And especially when she covers the next one where you actually cover, all three aspects or all three different colors that it could be, it gets a little scary, but only talking to the makers right now, it's not that scary. And then now I'm talking to the devs. It's totally scary. Make it a GUI, right?
Yeah, Yeah, so I mean, it's a great point because even though I'm trying to drive home that this looks ugly, to be honest with you, this is very nice. I like this as somebody who likes sort of the efficient expressions, and Ed, I know that you do. This is actually very nice. It's tight, it works, and nesting it all together in one compose action really makes the flow itself very efficient. But really, if you're just starting out and if you're, developing this for somebody and trying to help them understand, then yeah, for sure, use switch. So I'm not going to tempt the demo gods on this one and open this up, because if I lose that, that's going to be yucky to try to replicate on the fly. But basically, if we come in and go, let's just go a little bit closer. You can see that I've got multiple conditions here nested. So if we read through this, and I know it's hurting everybody's eyes, but there are two different if statements in here, whereas with the first one, there was only one. So we're adding that extra level of complexity here that we have to actually nest the full expression to resolve is banana going to be yellow or gray? We have to nest that inside of, is this apple? And if it is, and it's red. So there's multiple checks here. And so it works out to be the same, and I'm going to run the flow in just a minute and we'll see that it does fall through and it becomes the same. But for sure, when you're just starting out, this switch is just going to be a lot easier. All right, so let's back it up. Go ahead and run this again. Okay, cool. So I'm expecting red in both of these. And so certainly you do. You get exactly that. So you can see that the output here is the same, but the one key difference as well is that with the switch here, we're using a variable. And remember that Ed pointed out that if we're talking about efficient flows, we don't really need to use variables. We can just stick our values right inside a compose action, and this makes it nice and neat, super fast, and you can see how many steps there are between the two. So really just one here to accomplish the same thing that takes multiple steps here. All right, so how are we doing for questions? Do we have any questions coming up at this point?
No questions so far.
Okay. You guys are either really tired or we're just very, very clear. Okay, so I think we have time to just kind of look at one more demo, and this one's just more for explaining one of the concepts that Ed talked about before, which is that sort of try, catch, finally. And I just want to show what that looks like sort of in practice. So we're going to go into here to demo 2. Okay, and then for this one, all I've got is a simple, again, manually triggered flow, and then I'm just doing a get items on a SharePoint list. So something really cool here is that, if this fails or something happens with this, which you can imagine that if you're working with SharePoint data, it's obviously going to be a business case. There's obviously something that you're going to want to handle as far as the errors that come along. And really, I just want to point out that what I've done is set this so that if we configure run after, this one is going to, this one's going to actually run, this action's going to run if the get items has failed or has timed out. So sometimes when you are hitting SharePoint, you get this bad gateway error, which basically means, hey, I wasn't able to get anything, the server wasn't working, the server was slow rather. And so that's really difficult to handle. So what happens here is that we get an email if this times out or if it fails. And I've just put in here, your flow failed. So at least you're getting more information in real time rather than waiting for, those weekly emails that say, hey, something's been wrong for a long time. Okay, and then what I've got here is that what we can do is process the actual rest of the flow if the get items was successful. So this is configured to look at the send the email step. And so basically, if this one is skipped, if this is not being run, if this is not happening because SharePoint get items was successful, then we can continue with our business process. So this could be any number of things. So all I've done here to demonstrate that we're nesting some information is just thrown the title coming from the SharePoint get items into a compose. So this one would be super simple. Okay. All right, so that's it for my demos. If there are no questions, we can flip back over to the slides and finish up. Okay, all right, so the last bit of housekeeping here is that there is a raffle. So we're encouraging you to visit the vendors booths, watch the sessions, watch the videos. There's some answers to submit. So there are 3 of them that they're giving away, so super exciting. Go do that, go fill out your answers, get a chance to win. And then while we're doing some learning, let's do some good. So consider donating to a couple of the charity relief funds, and that'd be much appreciated. So that's it for us. Here are our Twitter handles. Absolutely feel free to follow us on Twitter and to reach out with any questions. Both Ed and I are always happy to help people learn. I think that's something that we definitely love to do. So feel free to reach out and I'll hang around. I think we'll hang around for a few minutes to see if there are any follow-up questions.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
thank you. Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks
everyone.
guys.